What's up and welcome to the Level Health Podcast. We've got Sophie Thomas on the show today. Sophie is a trainer, psychologist, and the author of the book Fitlosophy, which covers a psychological approach to fitness and lifestyle changes. Big thanks to Sophie for coming on our show. You can check out her Instagram at SophieT, that's SOFITEE, or her website fitlosophycoaching.com. We'll have both of those linked in the description below. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
Had you ever even considered a career in the fitness space at that time, or was it just kind of happenstance and just work out for you?
So it's really funny you say this, because at the time when I was a teenager, I was struggling with fitting in at school. My mental health wasn't particularly adaptive at the time. I was struggling with a lot of things. I didn't really know how to deal with it. I didn't really know how to cope. I didn't have the toolkits. And I think even at the time when I was in therapy, I was at that teenage age where I was like, oh yeah, CBT, whatever, man. And I think I did apply it a bit, but I think it's a far cry from when if I go to therapy now and I can actually utilize the tools in a more meaningful way. But anyway, I just was really struggling. And at the time, I didn't have many friends at school. And so I started going to the gym, funnily enough, for a not so wholesome reason. I say not so wholesome, but it was perfectly palatable. It was just not as meaningful as I train now. So I do modeling, and whilst now it's much more of a side stance and it's a bit of fun, and I take no meaning in the sense that it's not my identity, it's a bit of creativity. At the time, modeling was a bit of an outlet for me because as I said, I was struggling at school. And so staying in shape for modeling, I hate that term already coming out my mouth, but at the time it was a value for me because of what it represented and what it gave me when I was struggling. So I would go to the gym essentially to try and keep up with the Joneses, or on set, so to speak. But it's, as it always is, I fell into it for that, but I stayed with it for much more. And I realized, oh my goodness me, I'm leaving school feeling really low and going to the gym and leaving the gym feeling bloody awesome. And of course, luckily I was able enough to connect the two. And I realized how much training and fitness really helps ameliorate your mental health and your psychology and your mindset. And I realized then, wow, that really helped me. At the time, I had a great trainer who I still keep in contact with, actually. He's a really great guy. And I realized how much of an impact him just training me gave me. It changed my life fundamentally. I was incredibly depressed and low self-esteem, and just going to these gym sessions and having that structure transformed so many elements of my life that I didn't realize beforehand. So actually, I started to consider a career in fitness as of then. So it's funny how things that, as you say, were more just happenstance or hobbyist activities become something a lot more when they represent a bigger value for you on a deeper level.
What a precarious situation, because oftentimes, and in fact, one of the biggest gripes that I have with the fitness space and fitness professionals is they'll often feed into the very, very negative side, the very, very aesthetically focused, very restrictive, very limiting side of fitness, which is absolutely, of course, you broke away from that. Fortunately, with that fitness professional, it sounded like. But do you see that as really kind of like a very precarious position that you were in? And could it have gone in the opposite direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem is as well, as you say, a lot of fitness professionals, and this is not their fault, because you get told, you get given a personal trainer qualification, and that's what you're told to do, essentially coach people. And if someone comes to you saying, I want to lose weight, I want to get summer fit, whatever the phrase may be, it's not that they don't care or they don't necessarily think about the ethical implications. They want to please the client. So they think, okay, we'll get you there. And sometimes as a coach, you have to challenge the client's desires, because from an evidence-based stance, as we know, that's actually not only is it detrimental to short-term impact of body image, mental health, self-esteem, but long-term, there's very little evidence to it showing any sustainable impact on your long-term goals in any case. But there is a danger, I think, with professionals falling into the trap of thinking, I'm a personal trainer, I'm a fitness coach, I equate fitness coaching to purely a physical or aesthetic perspective. And like you say, I was very lucky with my trainer, because he swayed me away from, no, you're not just doing this to look like, to get really slim or to stay slim. There's so many reasons why you need to train, and so many reasons you can move your body. And I stayed with fitness for that, not actually for this very ephemeral and also, obsequious kind of image of myself that never really existed and never would exist in any kind of universe. It's kind of a projection of something I had in mind or envisioned. It was never there. And I think the problem is with the fitness industry itself, and this is not even just a psychology issue. I think in terms of research, they go just to straight S&C papers. Where, you've got like a group of 18-year-old collegiate men doing back squats saying, oh, this is the biomechanics of a back squat, clearly. And actually so many psychosocial elements that come into the paper that aren't addressed. And so their field of research, or they're taught, at least, it's obviously a filter. That filtrate teaches them to research only this kind of area. And actually, by stepping back and looking at behavior change, mental health, clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, all these other aspects, once you've learned and applied the concepts of research itself, you can look into these and think, well, hang on a second, actually, I'd be doing my clients a big favor overall in their quality of life by stepping away from that emphasis on aesthetics, even from a purely clinical research perspective, let alone a more holistic, empathetic stance as well.
Oh, I know. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned from like a results perspective, because I think too often we look at it and we're like, okay, this is progressive, or it's woo woo, or it's whatever it is. But in reality, if we're talking purely from a results perspective, like it's not even close. If you're helping people go through the process of behavior change and helping them identify their own values and what they actually want, whether it actually may be weight loss or it may end up not being weight loss. But if you want to look at it again, just from like a net effect perspective, it's not even close. Once you start taking a step back, and of course you have to understand the physiology principles, the principles of nutrition and things like that at not I'm saying expert level, but at least a proficient level. But really what I've realized is, and I've heard from many other professionals, is that really takes a big back seat. That gets moved back and it's kind of operating in the background, and then you're filtering everything through their life and everything like that. But I was wondering, how long did you go through this kind of transformation process? And then we can kind of lead into what led you to writing this book, and just kind of give us some background on that.
So it started, unfortunately, as the I don't know if you had this phase in wherever you're from, but in the UK we had a very big emo phase. So I was an emo teenager.
Oh, no. Yes, absolutely. My partner, Haley, right there with you. Absolutely.
100%.
It's come back, though. It's come back, I think.
I'm so happy for it. It's bringing back nostalgia.
Absolutely.
Not always the good kind. But I was besotted by doleful narcissism of like, life sucks. Everything sucks. And obviously there was massive mental health issues in there as well. But I was the cliched trope of emo girl listening to Paramore and My Chemical Romance thinking, oh my God, life is hard. These lyrics are so meaningful to me. There was a remedy for this, thank God. And that was one fateful day in a library on a rainy day. And I came across my very first philosophy book, which was Albert Camus' essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. And this at a time was when I was also training. So I remember reading it thinking, God, it's a bit like when I go to the gym and I have to do the same lunge or squat, thinking, why am I doing this? And actually, it's a bit like rolling that boulder up a hill. In essence, in its very being of a lunge, what the hell is the point of doing a lunge? But there's a meaning to it. I'm cultivating a meaning and assigning a meaning by the progress and procession of my sessions over time. I'm assigning my own meaning to it, even if in of itself, in its inert state, I'm just going up and down on the floor. And that really hit with me at the time, both from a practical level and for my own mental health, where I was struggling with existential questions, as most teenagers do. And I was thinking, how can I grapple these issues? And also at the time, my therapist wasn't an existential therapist. So I was coming to a CBT class being like, what's the meaning of life? And she was like, let's challenge that narrative. And I was like, well, I don't want to challenge it. I want to explore it. So for me, I started getting into philosophy, which sounds like I'm getting into some kind of gateway drug. Most people would argue I would be, because it can be potentially a trap of cognitive distortions and cognitive mental gymnastics, the likes no Olympics game has ever seen before. But I was really enjoying getting into philosophy and understanding these thinkers and how they grappled with the notion of human behavior, the human condition. And I mean, lots of thinkers, I mean, hell, a lot of them did a lot of grappling and wrestling, which turned out to be useful for me later. But a lot of them also applied it to physical wellness and how to conduct oneself overall through a life of living virtue and how to live virtuously. And I realized that even the structure of my routine, the structure of exercising, through then helped me be a better person in many ways, just by evaluating my thoughts and evaluating my actions. So I took this steadfastly into my fitness career when I transitioned into a coach. And I still to this day think, wow, that was really niche for me to incorporate philosophy. But actually it's not, because philosophy is the granddaddy of psychology. And I love philosophy dearly. I will happily read it till the cows come home. And when the cows do come home, I'll tell them, sod off, I'm reading my philosophy. But I understand no one likes to read Hegel or Kant, because one sentence can be 3 pages long. And I like to grapple with it because I'm weird, it's a hobby of mine, but it can be very off-putting. And I do think philosophy has an issue with gatekeeping and, making these concepts and books very lofty, and this whole you can't sit with us vibe in academia I didn't like. So I did various courses on philosophy as well to make sure that I kind of knew what I was talking about, and I did my work and studied them on a very basic level, on a fundamental level, like not a degree or master's or PhD level. That's why it's very much like philosophy for dummies in Fitlosophy. And as I was coaching, and I was utilizing these concepts both on a research level and empirical level through the psychology that we're studying, but also the philosophy, because sometimes I think philosophy just words it better. It leaves a mark sometimes that no P statistics or impact factor can. And it really helped my clients and myself. And as I was going through this, especially during lockdown, I was like, you know what? Sometimes people don't have access to coaching. And sometimes people don't want to listen to my crazy ramblings of someone who loves philosophy. What happens if I wrote a book which meant that people could access it if they wished? And if they didn't have access to coaching and were curious about my modality of incorporating psychological and behavioral habits with the beauty of philosophy and how we can use it to understand ourselves and how we can understand ourselves to live better lives in terms of health and fitness. What if I just did that? I think it would make everyone's lives easier. So I wrote it over lockdown, and the rest, they say, is history in terms of writing and publication. And it's something I never regret writing, because it's something I wanted to actually articulate originally as an ebook. And then I met a publisher in jiu-jitsu who said, I like the book, let's publish it. Jiu-jitsu, you meet some crazy cool people. So that's all I can say. So I was very lucky and fortunate that I met that person, because this would have just been a regular, but something that I was still very proud of, regular old ebook.
So your goal was to make this view or perspective more accessible to people, to be able to find it more easily. Did you find that you were having to? You mentioned jujitsu. It sounds like jujitsu, stoicism, philosophy in general are just kind of like in vogue currently, and so I'm sure that you had to kind of battle against that a little bit, because for instance, just with behavior change, you're seeing it has become more of like a hot button topic. People are trying to really espouse principles when they don't really understand the principles themselves. So is that something that you mentioned you took courses and everything like that? Is that something that you had to kind of like battle against and try to articulate in a way that's more able to be understood?
Absolutely. And it's so interesting you mentioned the stoicism thing, because I was actually talking about this with my friend who is much cleverer than me and has a PhD in philosophy. And we sometimes joke about the ways in which I can't believe we joke about philosophy, but this is how it goes and when you are nerds. But we sometimes joke about the ways in which stoicism is presented on social media, because I think a lot of people assume stoicism is like, no, emotion bad, don't feel emotion. Emotion is bad. You are a lion, even though you're just grappling someone in bathrobes. Like it's that kind of
that hustle porn. It's
weird. And some of the satire accounts, Chef's Kiss, I highly recommend them.
Well, time out. Can you recommend any of these? Because these are some of my favorite things to make fun of.
You know what? I'm going to send you this one. I think that's like something like the alpha mindset, but obviously it's so funny. It's like they have pictures of like Leonardo DiCaprio with nonsensical sentences, and it's just brilliant. And I'll send
fantastic.
It to you.
Yeah, I'll definitely be linking to that, because that is a side of human behavior that I feel like can certainly go away. It needs to go away, and it's so prevalent in our fitness space.
It really is. In the UK, particularly Scotland, we say it needs to get in the sea. So it needs to get in the sea. But stoicism particularly, it does not espouse any of these principles in any case. I mean, even if we're taking aside the research, which literally says this is nonsense, this does not work, Stoicism as a concept in philosophy talks about how to live ethically and virtually. It talks about virtuously, not virtually. I mean, I'm sure we kind of live virtually right now.
Yeah.
Zoom video.
Well, there you go. There's your next book for you right there.
yeah, virtual living. To live virtuously. But it's a huge emphasis on morality and ethics, rather than just this like occasional Marcus Aurelius quote. And I like Marcus Aurelius a lot. It goes a lot deeper, because it teaches you to live in a way that you would be proud of, and live in a way that confers benefits onto the greater community, rather than just this self-involved notion of being the man, being number one, of being goal driven every single day for yourself. It's very community orientated. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, ancient Greece essentially was one of the cornerstone development of socialism as a form of politics as well. So in terms of the debates they were having, it was never about this kind of individualism. It was always had the idea of the community in mind. So it's interesting how, again, in a lot of these self-development kind of biohacking fields, they extrapolate one aspect of behavior change, or they extrapolate one fancy shiny thing about philosophy or psychology, like, oh look, like the brain does this, or you can biohack your dopamine, and all these concepts, and people get excited by it and think, oh, this is how I'm going to live my best life. But actually they've ignored the whole swathes of research, and it's a cherry pick, and it can be frustrating. But I don't actually blame any of the fitness figures who follow this, because no one has time to get PhDs in, ancient Greek philosophy, or no one has time to get PhDs in the minutiae of the brain for specific regions. It's a tough world out there, and you have a lot of wild west kind of claims. And so in my book, what I tried to do is I tried to make it entertaining as well as evidence-based, which is very hard, because sometimes when I'm trying to explain Kant, I'm like, hey guys, we're going to talk about Kant today, and there's crickets, because of course it's Kant. And to do so in such a way that also encourages the people, or the person reading the book, when they are looking to explore what their goals can be, how they can, utilize understanding themselves for a greater level, also understanding that these philosophers and psychologists as well today, aren't philosophizing on how to be the best person, full stop. It's about exploring how we as human beings can navigate the world in such a way that there is a greater impact around us. I mean, I don't like Ayn Rand, I make it very clear in the book, but even Ayn Rand's philosophy is about having this greater use to the society at large, even though a way of getting there is not going to work. But still, the point stands, it's actually never about how to be the best number one person for yourself. And it's very interesting how these kind of modern day claims are very inculcated in the idea of the self, of like almost a solipsistic view of, right, how to get the best body for you, how to get the summer body for you, how to lose loads of weight for you. And actually, when we change our lifestyle, when we adapt our habits, as we look at the research, environment is a huge predicate as well for whether or not we assign ourselves to a habit easily, or whether it needs more tweaking. And that environment includes the social context of everything, the social cues. Who are we around with, and how are we able to assimilate all these goals into our life rather than the other way around? And that's what I wanted to try and get across in the book as well, to ensure that people were using these ideas and thoughts and concepts in a way that wasn't just about getting fit for yourself, but actually improving your well-being has a far more profound impact on people around you and the society around you.
Yeah, of course. So you're telling me, Sophie, that Epictetus back in the day was not a solopreneur posting his lions on his feet and his watch every morning when he wakes up and everything like that. Like the Stoic philosophy was not based about how to become the best supplement salesman, or wherever the hell people are using it for now. Like I mean, so I look at philosophy quite similarly, and perhaps incorrectly, but as allegorical, much in the same way as many religious texts. Not to get too far into religion here, but it's trying to explain how to be a better human being, and for us to try to then superimpose some of those principles onto very modern ideals and very modern values. It seems to be missing the point, and getting kind of like focusing on, like you said, the minutia, focusing. And then of course there's the people using just the flashy things, the flashy, whatever sounds the coolest of each little methodology, and then trying to espouse those as if they're the secret. And you see that within nutritional principles, within training principles. And in fact, something that I continue to see coming out of like the mass research review is that so much of training doesn't really matter. Like, for instance, for the very longest time, I would periodize a block periodization, and I would do the same rep ranges, increase load over time, increase reps, whatever it is. And now research is coming out saying that really varied loads is potentially just as effective, probably even more. I'm so hesitant to give any type of conclusive statements like that now, but so like we're realizing more and more this just really feeds back into the psychological component being just so much more more important. So it's not breaking my heart at all to hear you say the things that, we are so far divorced from what philosophy used to be or should have been. But I'm sure that it's hurting some people's feelings out there. These people that are using those motivational quotes to get through the day, or they're reading their daily stoicism quotes or whatever it is. I'm sure that they're a little bit, but they probably aren't there. Have you gotten any bad reviews on your book? And is that where it's coming from?
Everyone's been really nice.
That's good. That's good.
I assume it's also because people are very polite, which I appreciate. And I do really appreciate and value that. Everyone's been very appreciative. And it's interesting. I'm getting really friendly feedback regarding, I think I was this one. And then I read this philosopher and I felt more aligned with this way of thinking. And it's very interesting as well. And I, like you mentioned, if someone gets joy from reading, Daily Stoic, or, reading these more contemporary takes on it, more power to them. I think it's just being aware, as you say, that is going to help you along. It could help you reframe a negative cognition in your mind, which is awesome. We love it when suddenly we challenge a negative cognition. Everything's feels a lot clearer and more objective. But it's about understanding and grounding yourself in where that original philosophy came from. And it's so interesting you talk about the that mass research as well regarding the rep ranges, because philosophy can also be used to help articulate arguments and help articulate the way we speak to one another, the way we respect one another's differing opinions. And sometimes in the fitness industry, especially when it comes to research about you should do 8 reps, no, you should do 9.5, some of the vernacular spoken by others, I'm thinking, guys, you need to actually learn how to debate in a way that's respectful and also valid and sound in the premises you're putting forth. And I think philosophy can actually arm us with the power to articulate our thoughts, our arguments, and what we want to get across in a way that is respectful, even though some philosophers did throw total shade on one another. I won't mince my words. They did really throw some shade on each other, but we don't have to be those philosophers. We can be, hey, I'm going to take your very useful Aristotelian syllogisms and I'm going to throw them in here to make sure that what I'm saying to you is valid and that you feel respected by what I'm saying. So there's a lot of useful practical tenets we can take away from philosophy. Science used to be called the natural philosophy, actually, funnily enough, in a way that also helps support the science aspect of it. And that's what I try to do in the book as well, when I talk about things like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a very robustly researched form of, well, it's kind of CBT's third branch cousin, I suppose you could call it. Although it's same but different, I like to call it. But it's a robustly researched form of modality of therapy or psychological change. And even though it's kind of branching off philosophy, it's more empirical, it's more research driven, it's a modality in psychological sciences, borrows so much from a lot of the tenets of philosophy in terms of presentation, in terms of communication, in terms of a Socratic questioning. And actually, when you think about it, cognitive behavioral therapy itself was originally founded as a form of open-minded questions, Socratic questioning from a founder who was inspired by Stoicism and inspired by philosophy. So there's so much we can glean from philosophy itself that we can utilize in modern day psychology, even if it's diluted a bit.
I have not spoken with anybody that is better to ask this question to. So the Stoicism and Serenity Prayer, are those essentially analogous? I've never actually said the Serenity Prayer, so this shows how often I've gone to church, but basically the ability to accept the things that you cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. Is that just really like seemingly like a modern version of stoicism? And also the other side of that was, nope, I lost the other side of that. So is there a lot, I guess really the kind of the question I'm getting at, is there a lot of modern utilization of philosophical principles that have been around forever and we just don't really realize it? Or have they kind of, I think we tend to think that we're just much more modern, but I personally feel it's one of the more humbling things to think back to these people 2000 plus years ago having these incredibly insightful thoughts and experiences, and we're here worried about like the line at Starbucks or something like that. So is there a lot of this in our life that we don't even realize? And then one final thing on your book before we move on to kind of the fitness pro mindset ideas, what are some key takeaways that you'd like to kind of leave us with?
Sure. So with your first kind of question, I really enjoy this because most people are very, I suppose, respectful of the art of philosophy, but sometimes you get a lot of, it's actually funny. It's a term called scientism, and it's a problem in science actually, whereby there are professionals in science or researchers who will kind of poo-hoo philosophy, and they think, oh, we don't need that because we have science, we have empirical research, we have quantitative methods. And I am a quantitative researcher in many ways, so I appreciate that we do require computational methods, statistical methods, but I also know that, for instance, there are some aspects of interviewing individuals with mental health issues, for instance, that you can't quantify. You can't quantify a human being. We need more qualitative, more descriptive, phenomenological approaches to research. It's a hard word to say. And that's actually where philosophy comes. That's where philosophy actually comes into play. I mean, qualitative research is based on a lot of philosophical questioning itself. But even if we're looking at, as you mentioned, this idea of accepting what we cannot accept, this is a baseline fundamental teaching in dialectical behavior therapy. It's part of being able to accept something, knowing you can't have something or knowing it can't happen your way, and also knowing you're going to be okay. It's not going to be a catastrophe. And this is a modern day psychological form of therapeutic treatment. And this is what is being taught and used to treat people as well as a part of the therapy, of course. And so not only is it being used in a more empirical setting, but so many of the times we have just baseline discussions every day. We share, exchange ideas, concepts like, treat others like you'd like to be treated is something I hope that we espouse on a daily level, giving people basic decency and respect, and hoping they exchange that in return. That is a very fundamental concept in ethics and metaphysics, which for most famously associated with Kant for his the categorical imperative. It's slightly different, but the baseline knowledge of don't do something unless you can imagine everyone else to do it too. For instance, if you can't imagine everyone else to recycle, then don't bother making a rule for recycling, sort of thing. If you can't imagine everyone else to do what you think is right, then that's not something you should assign others, because if you can't imagine everyone doing it, then you shouldn't bother doing it yourself. It teaches people to be wary and respectful of others. And I think it's funny how it's so diluted in such a modern day setting. Into such a modern day setting, we almost take it for granted. And I think from baseline from my book, feeding back into that with regards to what people hopefully can take away from it, is that in the book I do try and get across the message that all these concepts of virtue ethics and living life meaningfully and in a way that's enriching to you, getting the most out of your life, can be done through your fitness by considering these concepts in philosophy. And by hopefully not only will you learn to be more individualized in your way to improve your life, to improve your health and fitness, and not be swayed by fads or pressured by certain semantics and myths. Hopefully also you'll consider the benefits of learning to live a way that's meaningful and virtuous, which I think is important. We should all be kind of evaluating, because there'll be times we all make mistakes or we might hurt other people incidentally, and that's important to be able to reflect on that. I think philosophy provides a space internally for your own personal exploration, and I think hopefully that's what the book drives across as well. I will also say, as a slight aside, it's funny, so many people will say, oh, philosophy is useless, we don't need philosophy. And you can always just jibe back at them saying, well, that's a philosophical statement, because it is a form of metaphysics and ethics by asserting or evaluating the normative values of something in terms of quality, and whether something is good or bad. It's actually a form of philosophy. So it's ironic when people say that.
Do you think that it takes I didn't really conceptualize this, of course, because I'm not sitting around thinking about philosophy, and I don't think many fitness professionals are. But I'm kind of happening upon quite a few things here. The fluidity of mindfulness, of understanding that, okay, yes, there is a very comforting, for me, it's very comforting, objective side of things, a very data-driven, very specific, very scientific side of things. But do you think that it takes quite a bit of work to develop that fluidity of mindfulness to, at the very same time, realize there's a subjective side of things, there's an individual side of things, a very, very very human side of things? Is that something, and what I wanted to touch on next was biggest obstacles that fitness professionals encounter, is, do you think that's one of them? I personally, I hadn't thought about it again until now, but honestly, I think that really is kind of a crux of the issue here, is because we can look at the research, we can say this is what needs to happen, but if the other side's not being considered, you are falling short, I feel.
I completely agree. And I think I think this is kind of something you learn in Psychology Research 101. You learn about the concepts between nomothetic research and idiographic research. So that is, in other words, looking at research that is more general. So that might be, for instance, looking at the effects of a drug on depression or cognitive behavioral therapy on depression in 1,000 people, versus something that's more individual. So there's fewer people in the study, but you go into immense detail about that person's individual experience and they describe it in great detail. So it's quantitative and qualitative, essentially. And actually, I think it's important for fitness professionals to understand and appreciate that both of them have a purpose. Yes, qualitative has its limitations, particularly with the sample size, particularly with the fact sometimes you just cannot quantify something you want to try and measure. So you might get skewed responses. But quantitative has plenty of issues. I mean, we have something in psychology, and actually in a lot of the science as well, called the replication crisis. And I think with fitness professionals, when you lean so far into these papers and you're like, oh my goodness, the P number is beautiful, I love it, you tend to think, wow, this is a really good study. But actually, there's a dark shadow lurking in many of these studies, because I'm going to do a quick analogy of the replication crisis, because it might help people listening to this who read papers, who are really involved in research to help their clients. And hopefully it doesn't make them too cynical. But essentially, the replication crisis is, imagine I make a really good recipe for cookies. I'm like, these cookies are amazing. You taste the cookies, you're like, yeah, these cookies are really damn good. Can I have the recipe? I give you the recipe for the cookies. Now, what I've not told you is I've had to do some tweaking here, because I've said to you that you only need this for this recipe. It's a magical recipe. Look, I only need this and this and this, and these cookies taste amazing. I haven't told you about certain grams being actually manipulated, and certain things are kind of hidden in the description and the ingredients and how to. So you get my recipe and instructions, and you try and make the same batch of cookies, and they come out disgusting, and you're like, whoa, hang on a second, I've tried Sophie's recipes and ingredients, and why haven't these cookies turned out the way I wanted them to? And the same, if we apply that analogy to studies, what happens is scientists or study designs will say, hey, look, we've got these really cool, amazing new results. This is great. It gets published. People or other new scientists or researchers or academics will look at these results and think, oh, that's awesome. I'm going to try this. Let's try and replicate this study. Let's change this because we want to find out a new finding. We want to build on the findings here. They try the study design exactly as described in the past paper, and it just goes, it just doesn't work. Now, it means that somewhere down the line, there's been papers that have been smidging numbers, phishing or hacking their data, and it creates basically a replication crisis whereby you don't know what's actually true or what's being told is actually fully accurate. Didn't get a full picture. It's a massive problem in psychology. Academic politics and stuff like that means that people feel more pressured to exaggerate to publish something. So when it comes to relying solely on the quantitative, solely on looking at the mass group and saying, yeah, this study found that these all individuals had this and this and this, is really important, I think, to also hold it with a pinch of salt. I'm not saying all studies have this, and I'm not saying all studies are badly designed, not at all. But in order to look at the best kind of papers for your clients and looking at robust studies, it's also important to know what makes a well-designed study or what makes a poorly designed study, because then you can start to sit back and think, actually, if we just go by that paper, it means that, everyone's going to experience back pain deadlifting. And actually, when we take a much better designed paper but isn't as famous because politics, we see that everything is much more nuanced because they've taken into consideration psychosocial elements, more qualitative elements, and it becomes a much bigger picture. And I'd also think sometimes the issue with the fitness industry is kind of what I mentioned before, is we're so set on reading S&C papers, nutrition papers, S&C papers, nutrition papers. And actually, for instance, someone's psychology, as you've mentioned before today, it has a massive part in the success or the fit or the mood in a session, and that has an impact on what goes on in a session. It's not purely just biomechanics at play here, especially when it comes to things like pain science, which is massively complex. So I would encourage fitness professionals as well, once you get a handle of research, once you get a handle of identifying what makes a robust paper, what makes a not so great paper, branch out. You don't have to understand all the terms in a psychology or neuroscience paper at all. It's more about, okay, I'm going to go to the findings, the numbers. This is how I got through my master's, literally just getting through to, I was like, this dissertation, don't have time to read the paper. I'm going to see if the numbers are robust and go with everything they're trying to say. And I would have a look at all these kind of different fields and see if they support some of the hypotheses or some of the claims made in these S&C papers, because sometimes the S&C papers make bold claims that other sciences, which have a bit more experience and I guess skin in the game in designing studies, will say, actually, have you thought about this? So broaden your horizons, I think, when it comes to looking at research as well.
Absolutely. I mean, like you mentioned, we don't have to be an expert by any means, but at the very least, you mentioned like the p-value being on point, but oftentimes I think people are just looking at the abstract and going to the very last sentence of the abstract and like, okay, tell me a very brief explanation here. But I would personally go like to the methods, and especially in like S&C papers, if you're looking at a sample size of like 10 people, take that with even bigger grain of salt. But honestly, in S&C research, that's not terrible. I mean, there's certainly bigger studies, but not in this field necessarily. Something that came to mind, if you want to be completely underwhelmed with research in general, I think I recommend listening to the Sigma Nutrition podcast, because they break down how just absolutely, and also in Mass does a great job of this as well. But like, there's not a lot of mind-boggling, earth-shattering research coming out. A lot of times it really is just a little piece of a larger question, and then oftentimes people will read what certain mechanism out of that, or just a small piece out of that, and they try to read it as gospel. But like, credit to the researchers, they weren't even trying to prove anything. They were just trying to get some data to keep moving, especially in a field like ours that's still evolving and still growing. So actually, if you don't mind, you kind of mentioned a little bit of how you got through your master's and the research and everything like that. What are some of the sections of a research paper that you would kind of hone in on first?
That's a really good question. So again, it depends. If you're time crunched and you don't have time to read papers, honestly, it's a bit of a slog, but I would actually go to the results. I would go to the not the conclusion, but the numerical results. Depends if it's, first of all, depends if it's a qualitative paper, which is more common in clinical psychology, where you have more interview-based questions. It's actually a lot easier to kind of pass through the results there. If you're looking at an S&C paper, let's say we're using an example, I would go to the results and just see not only just the P number, but look at the effect size, because sometimes something can be significant, but actually the effect size or like, for instance, you can have a significant results of one factor, but there's actually very little variance that factor contributes to the result overall for the overall effect. So sometimes it's important to look at the grand scheme of the results, because you can have a great significant P number or a very significant P number, but in the grand scheme of things, that actually doesn't lend much to what the result is actually saying. And then you can see if the claims they make are a bit exaggerated according to that number, according to the context of that data, or if they're in keeping with everything. So for me, results is kind of almost one of the first. Now, funnily enough, I also go to the design and methodology of the study, because I want to know the sample size. I want to see how they conducted it, because there's lots of ways that in that study design it can infiltrate or affect the results. And that's actually a really easy section of the paper. It's like, we did this, we set this up, and you can start to get a better idea of how the Confederates, the study set up designed the paper itself. Now, those two are kind of where I start to make conclusions about how the study is designed. then what I tend to do is, I don't necessarily go to the conclusion, because the conclusion they tend to make, that's when they tend to make the claims. What I actually do is I go back to the introduction, because I need to check that the premises they've made match the results, or at least that the hypotheses or the claims they want to make, especially near the end of an introduction, whether they match what they're actually trying to achieve in the results, the subsequent results. It's also quite good as a launching pad to other papers, because let's say you're reading a paper. Actually, I'm going to use an example today. I was reading a good meta-analysis on goal setting and health behavior. And in the introduction, they might have referred to a couple of papers regarding SMART goals and looking at what SMART goals have said. And they might have said, SMART goals have been utilized in healthcare to some success, but there's been, let's say, I'm paraphrasing massively here, there's been issues in long-term sustainability in patients, and they might cite 2 papers. I will make sure I go to those papers to see that what they've claimed is correct, because whatever they create a premise on in that introduction is the predicate for their argument in the whole paper. So I just look for a couple of papers in the introduction to make sure that everything is nice and smooth and that they've designed it well. But in terms of looking for, just if you're doing like a quick skim, results and design, that will help you get an idea of how the paper was designed and actually look at the raw data, because the conclusion is more about them discussing the data points, which you can definitely do, because sometimes they say, actually, yeah, there was an issue here, and actually this wasn't a massively significant result, and we need to consider X, Y, Z. That's quite useful to give you a framework. But if you're just kind of skim reading and you need to see if the paper is basically worth your time to delve into, I'd say results, design, and maybe look at a couple of papers mentioned in the introduction just to check it all makes sense. And then you can go a bit deeper into it.
Yeah, I found just in my own experience that it's not often the actual the authors of the paper that are going to be making these wild claims, especially within the media and things like that. It's people interpreting it and just not doing the due diligence to see, is this actually warranted, or this actually justified, the things that I'm saying justified based off of this information. So I think it's really kind of a superpower. It's like reading another language that allows you to glean information that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to. And again, like I've talked about analyzing research on this podcast before, and often I always have to remind, like, you don't have to be an absolute expert in it. It's just being proficient enough to understand it and to not be, I guess, bamboozled, or not be able to use the wrong information from that. Okay, so moving on, I think that we can kind of tie these next two together. What are some of the biggest obstacles that you see holding back fit pros, you work with in coaching? And then also, how do you feel that the fitness space just at large can improve overall?
So for me personally, one of the biggest things that coaches come to me for when they're struggling to help their clients just push forward or push past a barrier psychologically and make their lives more enriched, it's often the way they communicate it as well. And that kind of stems from, I don't know what to say in the situation, and I don't know how to even start the conversation. And that can often be a mixture of things. Sometimes it is just nervousness if it's a sensitive situation or a sensitive conversation, and other times it might be that they might need to refer to a couple of psychological toolkits or therapeutic modalities just to help them reframe how to create conversations or open-ended questions that get the client to reflect on themselves and also be doing the work themselves, in the sense that the coach is I like to say, the golf caddy. So they carry the golf clubs. They're not the ones doing the swinging, but they provide the client a space and a framework for them to discuss and explore, especially because obviously most of us aren't therapists or clinical psychologists. So it's obviously important we maintain those boundaries and are respectful of them, which is often where the research actually helps us create that boundary. So a lot of the times these fit pros come to me saying, I've no idea what to do when a client is saying these things about procrastination. I don't know how to tackle it. I don't know how to help them overcome this, and I don't know what to say to them. So it might take them, 1 to 3 papers, one paper describing the phenomenon of procrastination, let's say, like a meta review. Again, you don't have to be an expert or proficient. I make mistakes all the time. It's more about continually studying and continually looking at the data and being curious about it and seeing, okay, that method might not work, but this paper has a pretty robust impact factor and has been cited many times. Let's have a look at it, see if there's anything good there. looking at the phenomenon from one paper and then looking at that paper as a launching pad into other ways of, other studies of where people were struggling and had a specific modality within the group, and they got better, let's say within 2 or 3 weeks in terms of their habit change. As a complete blasé example, it gives them a framework and it gives them some support and understanding of what potentially they can do to approach the client. And then the next time comes the idea of actually talking to the client. So what I tend to do with my coaching clients, I actually do a little bit of a role play with them. So it might be that we pretend I'm the client and I'm really struggling with something, and the coach then communicates with me, like as if we're doing a check-in or as if we're doing some kind of call one-to-one. And obviously what I do after is I give some feedback in terms of, okay, that was really good. I really like the use of open-ended questions. Have a look at this modality, which uses these types of questions as well to help the client feel comfortable and get them to explore their experience of their thoughts or their feelings here, which will then get them to realize what they're thinking and what behaviors are going on after that, and then gets them to think about what behaviors they can do that is opposite to that behavior currently. So sometimes it's about the line of questioning that comes from these modalities. So it's often about giving the coaches a bit of a nudge in the right direction to the correct research, and simply put, some practical toolkits aligned with that research. And I think as a result of that, what the fitness industry can really improve from and glean from is don't be shy to borrow from different modalities. I refer my clients out to a brilliant psychologist, for instance, and actually I learn a lot from him. And we often bounce off each other because we also have quite a shared interest in the similar modalities, which helps a lot, especially when I've got a client and they feel very cared for because they've got a psychologist utilizing, let's say, acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm also utilizing some theories from acceptance and commitment therapy. It all feels very consistent. And let's say they've got an issue with anxiety or something, then that becomes a lot more manageable because you've got that expertise and that constant referral to the research and referral to experts who are not in your lane but can help you out. So I would definitely say that one of the biggest things I recommend the fitness industry is taking a big open embrace to the psychology field, the neuroscience field, and referring out not only to your clients, but I've had times where I've contacted cognitive psychologists, clinical psychologists with almost case studies and had a good conversation about it. And I've really learned something from my own research interest, but also in the sake of helping a client, it really helps massively. And I think now I see it's improving a bit more, but we are very staunch about the evidence-based protocol in nutrition and in psychology, and in sports science. And I think that can hopefully be extended as well to psychology in the future or in the near future as well.